on our street, they just hated our existence. And we actually had a neighbor who tried to burn down our house in the middle of the night when I was really young because they just hated the jungle people across the street. Hi, everybody. My name is Jacky So. I am Jacky with a Y. I'm a first generation Cambodian American born here in the States. I come from the startup tech side, like I think a lot of people do. In the last several years, I was leading distributed remote teams for multilingual access for health equity, which is like health tech equity, and appointments across the US for about at least 10 million appointments. And so now I'm actually working through a nonprofit at the local sector to help with some innovative efforts that will really put equity at the table, as part of everything that we do. That is, what drives me. And that's why I'm really excited to be here with Founders Voyage.
It's such a great pleasure to have you as our featured guest today. So, thank you so much for taking this time to share your journey with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. A little bit before this, we spoke about how important it is to be part of community and to be with community and to bring community with you in everything you do. So, no question or theme or topic is off topic. I think it's important to share everything as part of the journey, like not just the highs, but a lot of times it's a lot of the lessons. And sometimes it's things that you didn't have the maybe vocabulary for or like the space to process when you were younger, but looking back on it, you're like, oh yeah, that's what it was. And so I think anything that would help other people kind of as part of wherever they're at in their journey, get to where they need to be faster, I think is a net positive.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that perspective. And actually, one of the questions we like to lead off with is, can you tell us about some of your experience growing up? Do you feel like you're kind of talking about this in the beginning in regards to your name, but just kind of on the whole, where there's some, early life events or particular people that came into your life that you really feel kind of shaped who you are and kind of shaped the direction that you've taken?
That is such a great lead in question because I think it is very grounding and very formative for like how somebody is and how they operate and how they think about the world too and see things connected. So when I was younger, I mentioned I'm first generation Cambodian American born here. And I always have to say the Asian diaspora is so large and we represent so many countries. It's 48 technically, or it's over 50, depending on what other areas and countries you consider countries. But as part of kind of being part of this diaspora, even in terms of having a standard terminology of saying if you're first or second generation, it differs. And so for me, I am first generation born here because my family, my parents had immigrated and they actually missed the Cambodian genocide. And so there's a lot of, I think, growing up and being so cognizant that you are likely the first and only Cambodian a lot of people in your suburb are going to come in contact with. And there is definitely a responsibility to make sure that you do your best you can to not have people think of you as jungle people. And that was kind of a very, very candidly that, our neighbors hated that we were on the same street as them. It was a new neighborhood, it was Mission Viejo, California. I was extremely active in my community and in my city. And yet on our street, they just hated our existence. And we actually had a neighbor who tried to burn down our house in the middle of the night when I was really young
Oh my
because they just
goodness.
hated the jungle people across the street. And I think in his mind, he thought that would solve like the solution. And I think the genesis of my tech journey and why I'm so passionate about data is because this was just an example of some of the things that would happen to us and to our family. So I think it was kind of a twofold thing because these events were happening and these things were happening to our family internally. Now I understand the language parentified, being parentified when you're a child. I knew I was a child, but I never felt like a child. I always felt like a responsible adult who needed to do things, on behalf of the family to represent the family and the community. And so when things are being done to your family, I think internally in your internal structures, it almost even more is like, okay, well, you can't let them know that we don't understand this. You have to, like, you are parentified even more, I think, externally to try to show that your family belongs here and doesn't take up resources, especially as like an immigrant family. And then on the other side of it was realizing that this data was not tracked because hate crimes are not considered crimes in Mission Viejo, at least at the time when I was growing up. Maybe it's changed. And so Mission Viejo was the number one safest city in the US for its size because hate crimes are not crimes. So then I remember thinking, like, okay, I love all the things that I'm being part of, but safe for whom? And so I think for me that really kickstarted my whole thinking about realizing the systems at play and like how systems are built. People are aware of things, but how can you impact change and how can you be a change maker, especially if it's kind of like things that you are aware and putting together, like that's not even getting tracked. How can you help track those things? You have to even know to ask those questions to begin with. So I think ultimately that has been, a big part of forming how I look about where I'm at in my community and in the world. And really, I would say, in terms of having mentors or people who I could look up to, I've had a lot of people really believe in me. But I think because of how I grew up, I never really had like a mentor. Like I always had to be that for other people and I had to be that for our family as well. It wasn't until I got to grad school, I was a non-traditional student going back to school where I was in Philly. And I just give Philly so much love because I credit Philly with my awakening, is what I call it, and really seeing the systems at play. And you live where so many people want equity and want things to be great. And I think having really, really hard discussions, this was before Black Lives Matter had taken a really like national spotlight. This was 2014. I did grad school at a med school. And I remember being in this community and we were in our building and we had staged a Black Lives Matter protest. And I remember initially being like, oh, I was like, but I was that person where, coming from Mission Viejo and like Southern California, I was like, I get this, but like, are we pushing people away? And like, but everybody matters, and that was exactly the point. And I think I really leaned into it and I really wanted to learn more. And I really had a lot of people around me who had walked a different path who could kind of take me with them. So I credit Philly with a lot of that. And I feel like I haven't really had mentors in more of like I had life mentors, in Philly from a lot of the professors who were there and recognized in me that I was struggling with like a lot of inherited trauma, and kind of familial guilt and those kinds of things. And, big thanks to them, I was able to let it go, and where I'm at now is I think that's why everything I do is from a community perspective, because I didn't have mentors. I definitely did not have Cambodian women in tech who I could look up to and relate with. And so for me, the way that I kind of fill that bridge or that gap is by surrounding myself with other people who are kind of figuring things out together. And so that's the community. It's like I didn't have a mentor, but I have my community who, in a way, like we can help each other. So that's my whole.
Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry, like, you went through some really, really difficult things, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. I read a quote saying this recently, how one of the best signs of like intelligence and bravery in someone is that they can be a really positive, kind person when they've gone through really hard times. And it seems like, you've got the big smiley faces behind you, you're very
I
smiley,
do.
just seem like a very, very happy person, and you went through some very difficult things. How do you keep a positive attitude, and how important is that in your worldview, so to speak?
Well, Spencer, thank you for saying that. That is very kind of you. I, I joke that there's something wrong with my brain, and that and and that in the American system of doing business, there is this bias towards like extroversion and optimism and positivity. And I don't necessarily believe that's fair either because we all have different work personas. It's almost like there is this assumption that if you're not outgoing, that you need to fix something about yourself, like in the business world. And I don't believe that's fair. And I'm like, I actually think it's more normal to be introverted or to kind of be really quiet and reflective, in what you're doing. And for me and how I show up, I am a corgi as a person. I see a person, I get excited. I really want to know more about them and get to know them and build a relationship with them. And so the example I give is my husband is a cat, and we're a corgi and a cat. And I believe that it's how I am, sometimes my energy and how I show up in being so excited and happy. I am mindful that that's not always the energy needed in the room at the moment. And so I always tell people, if this, like, just tell me to chill, like I won't take it personally. But I think like how I show up is actually like atypical. And I think a lot of it, to your point, you're kind of getting to, is because of how I grew up, where I'm just like, all right, well, I'm here, like I'm still here. So it's a good day. Like I'm like, I came from the startup world, right? And which is the understood, unspoken understanding of living in startups and being in startups and coming from startups is the toxicity of like of your environment and just like kind of like your work and everything. But for me, I'm so used to it. It's actually where I thrive. And I think so much of it is because there's a lot to do, not enough people to do it. You might as well give it a shot and try. So when things are looking pretty bleak, a lot of times the way that I kind of think about, like, okay, well, like I'm still here. So what can I do with what I have right now with like my resources? I can still do something, like maybe the way I need to do it is different from how I would have done it in the past, but I can still do something. And so whether that's work or whether it's, being a change maker to try to make sure that your communities have the resources they need, that I think is almost like where I default back to, is that I'm like, well, we're still here. I'm still able to find people. Again, I'm just going to keep talking about community with me who are, and us together, we can do something when things look pretty bleak. And so I think so much of it is formed from how you're right, like how I did grow up. And a lot of it is like, I'm alive. I'm here. I'm grateful. I'm healthy as far as I know. I learned I have allergies, but for the most part, I have great vision. I have my hands, like I can still code. And it's always, I think, being like, I believe in myself and what I'm capable of. And so as long as I have the chance to show up and do that, then like, I'm like, we're going to be okay. And that's how I kind of logic with myself, when things are really hard.
I love that, and I am so sorry that you have been through such difficult circumstances, but I really do love that you've let them bring out the best qualities in you. I loved that you described yourself, as a corgi, as a person, and your husband as a cat. But that is just like such an understanding of kind of, the strengths that you both bring to the table. Understanding that as part of a startup team is kind of paramount. What you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, but I know it took a lot of work to get there. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for liking the corgi analogy. If I can say, it's
I love
corgis
it
are,
so
I'm like,
much.
it's because I think
Yeah.
corgis are derpy looking like me, we're just like, you kick us down or you try to kick us down. We're just like, that's cool. You want to play? Like, this is fun. And they're workhorses.
Yeah, it's true. They're very resilient and they don't give up. And I was going to say, I saw a meme the other day too that like when you mix any dog with a corgi, it's really just, a corgi disguised as that dog. So I kind of like that, like those qualities are always going to be present no matter, what the person looks like, so you're going to recognize that in your community. Can you talk about how you became interested and pursuing a career in tech? Because I know that was kind of a big decision for you.
So I think you will notice an emerging theme as part of this conversation. It actually, I was always, I wish I had, there's this drawing I found that I did when I was really young, and I framed it. I don't have it up yet on my office walls, but it was me drawing two people on each side of the world video calling each other, and this was like early 90s, I think, when I drew this. And I remember coming across this. I'm like, So I was always interested in this, but I was actually actively dissuaded from it. And there is a big piece of it of, I think, being raised how I was, and I think being the parentified workhorse one on behalf of the family who would go and try to smooth things over when there was like drama with, somebody else, that like people are saying the same things or they're thinking about the same things, but they're using different language. And so there's always a miscommunication, and then people end up fighting, and they always send me to go on behalf of the family to try to, it's almost like I was like the mini diplomat of the family. And I wasn't the only one. My younger sister and I would take turns. For us, anyway, being Cambodian American, and it was always so much around like what you're supposed to be doing, what you should be doing, and how it's going to look on the family. Like, oh no, people are going to say things like it's going to look bad if we have like our daughter who is doing what they considered a very masculine role, which is pretty silly. It's just because history is written and rewritten by whoever, is able to do it and omit accomplishments that people have contributed. And so I was actually actively dissuaded from it. The hot keyword that always came up in our family was forbidden. You are forbidden. You're forbidden from doing this. You can't do this. It's going to make me look bad. Like, you're forbidden. And sometimes it's in Cambodian, sometimes it's in English, but it was always like being forbidden from doing things. And I was forbidden from pursuing computer science and tech. It's not what they believe women should be doing. That wasn't a role for me. And I think there was also just this almost like people in general want to believe they made up their mind about you before really wanting to understand like you and your own journey. And so I think they just also, there was a refusal to kind of acknowledge and look at me as like what I was capable of, other than being like a beauty queen. Which is very, very sad. But that I think is actually inherently tied to being Cambodian American, because of like surviving the genocide. What in terms of spreading Cambodian culture, the one thing that people always go back to is being like, look at our Angkor Wat, look at our Apsara, our engravings, our women are beautiful, look at their bodies like on the temples, when they engrave it. And so like no one's explicitly said this, but this is something I kind of pieced together and realized. So I think like in representing being Cambodian, there was such an emphasis on how you look and how you present, how other people want you to present, because you are trying to show that Cambodian women like exist from the temple, like what they saw in the temples, like here you still are many generations later. And that's almost your proof of being Cambodian. And so I think there was a lot where it was like, you can't do tech, you can't do those things. Like you need to do something where it's like, we can like ooh and ah at you kind of, which is like, very icky to say. I'm just like, oh gosh, like if I could go back to younger me. And so I think so much of it is I found my own way there somehow. I kind of again, it goes back to not having mentors. I didn't have anyone who understood what I wanted to do. When I was in university, I studied poli-sci, bio, and business together, and people didn't understand why. They were like, if you want to go to med school, just do bio. And I'm like, no, they're all related. And I have years later, like 20 years later, I have people who are practicing now, and they're like, oh yeah, I see why, because of like, all of the administrative policies and all those things that impact really their ability to show up in practice, which I think is a lot more prevalent now and people are aware of it now. But at that time, people were like, I don't get like why you're doing all these things. And in my mind, I was like, because I'm going to bring them all together. I don't know how yet, but I know like somehow they're all going to intersect. And so the way that I really got into startups was, I think, looking around and being like, I was out of grad school. I would say officially startups, because I'd always done startups in some capacity, but like officially being recruited to startups and being one of the first in a lot of different companies to help them build some really foundational things. It was thinking about what my Northern Star is, which is like, am I showing up for my community in the way that's needed? Am I building seats at the table? Am I taking my community with me? If I'm the only one sitting at that table, then I failed. I shouldn't be like the token diversity person. Like it needs diversity of life paths. It needs everything. And so looking at that and seeing, what companies out there were really coming from an equity perspective. And a lot of them at the time were startups. And so I was like, what do I have that I could say, hey, I can gain trust in touching the tech. And then once I can just get access to it, I will figure it out, and it was being a community builder and a community manager and pretty much like business analysis, project program management, all of that I'd done in every capacity of all my roles. And once I was able to pitch myself in that way, then I would see other things that were people didn't have the capacity to take on that were all like database related and like tech related and data related. And I was like, this is great. Like, let me take a stab at this. And I think that just really informed the trajectory because I just got so into it. And I started from an equity perspective, finding what was hidden in data or what we didn't have in the data and how we could actually then like build features and things that would really help community clinics and a lot of people who just kept getting put into like the other bucket of data who then would get missed when we would automate things, because they were frequently becoming edge cases. I think like that, just seeing then the result of like what that could do and how that could help people, it just, lit that fire where I'm like, this is what I want to do everywhere I go. But, but that really was I wasn't allowed to do it, but I found a way.
You mentioned a sort of recurring pattern in your story where you're sort of told you can't do something or that it's the wrong way to do something, like with your nickname, with pursuing tech. And you're like, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to do it with a smile. And I love that. That's really, really good.
Hi there. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you mind leaving us a review, a like, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform? Thanks so much. That really helps our reach. The Founders Voyage podcast is now proudly sponsored by VidOps. Kane at VidOps has been taking care of our editing since early 2024. He works efficiently, and I'm sure you'll agree that he does a great job. Thank you to VidOps for helping bring this podcast to life. If you want the same great support we're getting for your podcast, or you need help with video, photography, or animation, you can get 10% off at vidops.io using our referral code Voyage. That's vidops.io, referral code Voyage. Now back to the show.
You've mentioned about how sort of you started to get into startups and how the data connection is there for you. Can you talk a little bit about your time with Primary Health, from building the company to piloting the health equity software and whatever else you think is like important highlights?
I can, yeah. I will always have a lot of love in my heart for Primary. So Primary, actually, our CEO, because the pandemic had happened, I was burnt out from my previous role. We worked together at a previous company. We got acquired by really great people, but it's one of those things where as part of a company getting acquired, anyone who's been through this, I think knows like what it feels like. And you can have really, really great people coming together as part of one now like new entity, but the inherent culture of the different offices can kind of change a lot for your day to day. And so when I joined, it was called Better Doctor. And so when I joined Better Doctor, and I have to go back a bit in order to talk about Primary, but when I joined Better Doctor, I kind of explained it as like it was like a Finnish founded company. It was in San Francisco. It was founded by, a bunch of Finns who are great technologists. And it was what we thought, and I thought I was going to help fix health insurance in the US. And I think if you have a group of really great technologists who believe they can also help, it will be Finnish people who have great healthcare and came from Nokia and everything. One of the main reasons why I joined was because one, my manager was going to be a woman of color. I had been searching for this for so long, and I really, really wanted her to be my manager and to learn from her, especially in tech. And then also the culture. The Finnish culture is, everyone's an adult and a seasoned professional. Like, we trust you to do your work. There is like no micromanaging. You get your work done at a time that makes sense for you. And when we come back together, like, it'll be done. However you want to use your time, you're completely autonomous. And that is how I work. I will come back from something from like a weekend and I'll have something built, and which I sometimes am super productive at night, which I think a lot of people who do tech are. And so that was kind of our culture, right? And when we got acquired by a company that was based in the Midwest. And so they had very defined hours. It was very like, you clock in and you clock out at these certain hours. And because we were a startup and they were an established company, our paces also differed. And so it was just kind of a lot of foundational, like the reason why I joined in the first place had completely shifted into like now we were acquired and that had changed. And so, and as part of, getting acquired or merging two companies, you're also constantly restructuring as you're trying to figure out what everyone's new role is. And so we had so many organizational changes, so many. I remember, I think in a month I counted it and I was like, we had like 20, it was like, it was because and so a piece of that was I was one of the first ones to go through this process as a data engineer to be a data engineer. And it was a very, very lengthy process. And I really wanted to continue on for it was actually an app that I had built. And so it was like for me to formally be able to then be the person who like manages it. Man, I just got burnt out because I was like, what am I doing? I think like what am I doing here? I don't want to keep like changing my title like every so often or my role. And so I am just going to take a step back right now and go think about like what it is and where I'm going. Like if that's here, I had an open door to come back and like I love everybody at Better Doctor, but if not, like maybe I'll start my own thing, which is how I founded my LLC, which is for startup consulting. And then the pandemic hit, and the person I worked with previously, he's like, "Hey, I'm CEO of this company. Like, I need you here. Can you please come join?" And I'm like, "Of course you would be. That makes sense." It started as a pure volunteer effort to get communities access to resources. And at the time, we didn't have vaccines, so it was testing. Primary was volunteer effort, getting testing to the communities who needed it the most, who were the most disenfranchised, and you have people who we say are our essential workers, and yet we weren't giving essential workers like the protection, resources, and everything, and even like the language access that they needed to even know how things impact them. And he knew that I could do a bit of everything. But at the time, I said, "Hey, I have some clients, I have some projects. I can't just drop them. I have to." And he's like, "Okay, we'll wrap it up. And then, like, I'll call you in another month or two," which he did. I trusted him. I was like, if he's saying this, I will wrap this up. I'll try to go light on the kind of workload that I have so I can pivot. And so I joined, and I was one of the first, like, we call them like core ground people. Like, we started with just a handful of us and we built up the company to like almost 200. But as part of, I think, the flux of pandemic life, and especially with health, health equity and health equity tech digital divide resources, you also go through cycles of highs and lows, and you are shepherding a lot of people and guiding them through the organizational change that comes from like multiple rounds of layoffs, and that also, I think, inflicts a lot of trauma on your colleagues who are trying to do, and they are doing like amazing work. It's almost like you have to keep reestablishing some sort of foundation every time for homeostasis. And so one of the things though that, we started as a volunteer effort, I was the front facing person. So I would meet with a lot, I don't call them clients, I call them partners, because it goes back to being like everyone should be at your table. Like you're not doing things to people, you're doing things with people. Who am I to know what's best for people? Like they need to tell me what their actual end-to-end workflow is. Once I can understand that, I'm like, okay, like this is what you're trying to do. I can actually like now help. I'll do as much as I can until I have to hand it off to engineering for them to then implement, and we can make it happen. There's some trade-offs, but we can make it happen because I understand like what engineering needs to see in order to make this come alive. Because sometimes the person, like your community clinic or your client, who like I call partners, your partners aren't using the right they're thinking of the right things, like they're thinking of it in a good way, what they envision, but what they're saying is not how they need to be communicating it in order to make a technical person understand what you're trying to do. And so much of the early work that it really helped us scale was me meeting with people during the day and then understand like what they wanted. And because I was overseeing partners in all the time zones, then I was able to figure out how to align all the things they were asking for into then certain like feature requests and products. And I was like, this is how it would work. And then at night, I would do the coding or I would do the workarounds, which were usually like data dashboard related. Like sometimes all they wanted was a data dashboard. And we don't have to build an entirely new feature for that. I can actually go into our data model, do some things, kind of change some configurations and customize it for them and then deliver that to them because that's what they need to report to like their board of directors. And so it wasn't always like needing an engineer a lot of the time. And so a lot of those things I had done quickly became essentially their own products. And that helped a lot of groups and partners be able to scale how they were trying to deliver like health equity resources, without needing an engineer. After almost 5 years of that, I think maybe like 4 years in, I already was thinking like, I feel like I've done everything I've been allowed to do here. We had some changes as part of, I think, when the administrative policies changed, I will say last November. I remember seeing a lot of when you're a company, there's so much of what you do. There's what you want to do and can do, but there's also what you're enabled to do. And a lot of it's from a funding perspective. Funding is so important. And I wish there was funding and grant writing and things like that. I wish there were like workshops on for every new startup employee to take about it to really understand like why is your client, suddenly shifting on what they want to say and why does this seem really time sensitive? And a lot of it is because they can do what they can do, especially nonprofits from a funding perspective. And, they have some deadlines they need to meet. And I remember getting to the space where I was asking myself if I'm effective anymore in like what I'm doing, because what I believe the way I want it to go was make sure that I'm building things that like my communities are telling me they need and we can do it. And I think we shifted gears a bit in that. And so for a while, I was like, I'm going to stay here as long as I can and like help all our partners and my colleagues. And, I love what we do and I believe in the mission. But I think I'm ready for something else. And maybe that's building my own thing. Like, I'm not sure. And I think ultimately it was realizing after the administrative changes in last November in 2024, because I'll just time date this. So a lot of our partners were just stuck. Like all of the work we had done was paused. They weren't sure what the future was going to look like for them. They weren't sure if they were going to have a team. They weren't sure if things were going to be clawed back, in terms of resources. And so even if on paper it makes sense, but like when someone's not ready to psychologically commit to signing anything or extending a contract, there is like no amount of selling you can do to them, if they're just psychologically not ready for that, right? I was like, okay, I was already thinking about this, witnessing that. I think it really solidified how I saw myself in my decision. I was like, I have done as much as I can do here. There's more I can do, but I'm seeing what's happening on the ground. And so maybe I can go and help things that make progress on the ground, like behind the scenes. Like maybe the way I need to do it is not in a front facing role. It's kind of like, behind the scenes, like in the shadows, like just, focusing because everything else is going to be chaotic. And maybe I can be the person who like focuses on the work. And so that ultimately is actually how I got recruited by Fuse, this amazing nonprofit. I had already been thinking about this and I was like, the next thing I do, yes, I have Data with Style LLC, which is my startup consulting, but I wanted to build like a tech nonprofit in Albuquerque, which is where I live now. I have some ideas about how that would look. They're like fuzzy ideas I'm not ready to share yet, but the way I would do it is slightly different. Not slightly, it would be different. And I feel like I want one more thing in between. Like there's still a lot I want to learn and I just want one more thing. And I think after being part of so many rounds of layoffs, I would not want to start a company and bring people in on it unless I knew I could sustainably support us because there's a lot I can do alone. And I would not want to reopen any of those wounds that people have, being part of such tumultuous atmospheres. Like I can't do that to them too, right? And so I actually got recruited by Fuse. I had just changed my LinkedIn settings. And I was like, I'm going to go clean up my LinkedIn because it is a mess. I use it to log for myself, for future me to remember what I did. It's like a mess in there. And I changed my settings and immediately I got contacted by a Fuse recruiter who really liked like all of the work I had done from a business analysis, program management, and like the tech perspective. And Albuquerque had some really innovative projects as part of the Office of Equity Inclusion that they're doing. And one of the things that they have announced, so I will say it now, is one of the many innovative programs that they have and they're working on. One is launching an official Asian Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian office, population office, which is so specific and so amazing, for a local government to realize is needed. Because we have other population offices. And so we have an official liaison for that who's amazing. And so I'm just behind the scenes kind of doing the things that will help him figure out what that could look like, when we officially bring community together and launch this, because it's been identified that actually like the Asian community, which is very broad in lots of countries, is the fastest growing demographic in Albuquerque. For me, I'm like, this is great. Like, what does that data look like? What do the subgroups look like? And that is a piece that I don't know yet, but I really want to work on. And so much of it is being able to bring the things that I had carried from primary, which are things I had carried from Better Doctor, which are things I had carried from being exposed to kind of like health equity in grad school at a med school in Philadelphia. Like all of those pieces have been a through line into really kind of like catapulting me into coming into a new space, where things overall, it's much larger, thousands of people. Your department is small and mighty, but there are some formal, structures in place. And I think it really has helped me kind of navigate and be like, actually, technically, we're this is local government, but for what we're trying to do, we're actually like a startup, in the local government, which was kind of fun to realize. And I'm like, I can help with this. Like I was a startup person, other people were not. And so I think for them, they're like, oh, this is a new way, of some of these programs and things happening. And I have been able to quickly be like, you know what, this isn't new to me. Like, let me guide you through this.
That's so exciting.
Thank you. A lot of it is carrying, primary and the other startups into kind of what I'm doing now. So that will catapult us into whatever you have next.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love that you see that common thread, from sort of your refusal to kind of like choose in your grad program, and your ability to kind of see that diversifying your education would be so powerful later on, even though you didn't know exactly how. Letting your mind and your heart kind of guide you, realizing, that it is all interconnected and it is going to come together. And even your flexibility to see yourself as someone that can be in that front facing role, which a lot of programmers I know fear, but also being willing to hop in the back when needed. I just love your willingness to flex to serve the greater good.
Thank you. And I realize I just am giving you lots to edit. So I apologize.
No, 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 you're fine.
I call it brain dumping. So I'm brain dumping right now.
We kind of got like, both some of your ideas for the future and then, some of your career experience. And I was wondering, I know this is something you're super passionate about. Can you talk about some of the biggest equity issues you've dealt with in data and how starting, your own LLC Data with Style has given you the capacity to address some of that?
Thank you. I think the biggest data issues are the things that I've seen for equity. It's like I wouldn't have realized how big language access plays. And because I care about language access, but I think realizing it's almost been the one, not singular, but really one consistent subject that I have brought to like every table I've been part of, because a lot of the data in equity is so dependent on what data you do capture. And in order to capture that data, you have to understand what you're even asking or what you even need to ask and how you should be asking it and who you should be asking it, from. And a lot of the times, especially in equity, you have people who they're not being approached from their lived experience or their perspective, or maybe even the sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, and even in the language that they would need in order to really understand the depth of what you're asking.
Sorry, just to ask you to give a little bit of clarity about the term language access. I think I understand it's like knowing the right words to communicate an idea. Is that
Thank you, Spence. A bit. It's that, and also in different languages. So in people's native languages, or even in like sign language, people can speak English, but for what you're trying to gather and understand about them, like, is English actually the best language, or is that just the default language that your team had? And so when you're trying to build like the surveys and you're asking people about things, because that is going to that's going to be the data that you work with that's going to inform the things that you build and how you even build programs or do like any automations. And so language access is everything that you said, Spencer, plus the acknowledgement and consideration of getting things also properly translated, like not using Google Translate, but actually like culturally sensitive, nuanced, language in the languages that people need in order to really be part of your table and contribute in the way that they want to contribute and feel like they're going to be understood as well. Because it's like, some translation, like most translations are not literal. And, like the word, I learned this like in Vietnamese, for example, the word for, the way it's used, the term that you use in Vietnamese changes based on what the intention of the question is, for that word for. So for language access, I think from an equity perspective and even data, that has been in the beginning, it needs to be baked in as part of the process and not kind of like something after the fact, because a lot of times a component of it also requires a budget and turnaround time in order to do language access for equity. And a lot of times everyone's moving fast and they're trying to do really great things and they're doing great things in the equity space. But then it always comes down to like right before it's about to launch, it's like, oh, can we get this translated in other languages? And especially depending on like your work environment, depending on who's available to do it, who can do it, it's almost twofold. Are you constantly putting the burden on fellow people of color again to like do this lift in order to have their communities be represented? And then also, is there a budget that's needed for this? And then even for the bandwidth for the people who you need translations from, do they even have enough heads up about it in order to really do it? So that I think is the biggest issue I am finding in the equity space. And I was talking with a lot of people from other spaces, and language access is the one thing that kept coming up over and over and over again. Which, when I decided to join Fuse, one of the things I had talked about as part of my journey was really making sure we had multilingual access for a lot of healthcare appointments and being able to capture a lot of the culturally sensitive and nuanced information that like a provider, whoever, a healthcare worker, a community clinic would need to see. And that was a thing that for me, I'm so used to doing that. That is like the first thing I think of when we're planning. I remember sharing about this and other people being like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, and so we still have kind of a gap to address these things. And so having that perspective and those experiences as part of Data with Style, I do a lot of startup consulting. And I do a lot of things where, people are trying to respond to RFPs, for example, but like the way sometimes it's interesting. Like I've helped people figure out how they should be like what they need to actually respond to RFPs and what the person writing the RFP or the team writing the RFP is actually hoping for and looking for. They might not have written it, but like ultimately from my experience, like this is how it ends up rolling out and this is what ends up happening. So if this like language access isn't, for example, in like the application or isn't in the request, if you're comfortable with it, you should actually call it out and say, hey, this is actually like, a very needed piece. And this is the reason why. There are a lot more things and lofty goals I have that I want to do with Data with Style, but so much of it is kind of tabled right now as I work with our nonprofit and helping, our local government launch, some really, really exciting projects. And so one of the things actually that I kind of wanted to use Data with Style for fun, but from a data perspective, I really love Eurovision. And from a language access perspective, I was like, this would almost be that like subconscious way to try to bring people in on something that's like cross-cultural and something that's language related. And then also show like, hey, and then here are ideas about like the data. And here's actually the end-to-end workflow to do this. Like you can apply this for your startup. It doesn't have to be, something kitschy and fun like Eurovision. And so a lot of what I've been able to also do through Data with Style, most of it actually, it's been a lot of varied things, but I would say the most common theme I've identified comes from, it might be called different things, but it's ultimately language access is like the missing piece for so many companies and so many startups and so many projects that they're trying to launch. And that's going to impact like the equity data that they have.
Thank you. I feel like data is such an important part of the world right now, especially in the startup space, but it's also from a lot of people just not understood, right? There's a lot of like ways to intentionally or otherwise misrepresent data or use data in a maybe positively intentioned but negative way, especially with like AI coming in. What I'd love to hear from you a little bit about is about AI and your perspective on it and how sort of hopefully it can be used to improve access to it and the democratization of data instead of just locking it away.
Yeah, I am currently actually speaking with a lot of people in different spaces, also in other like local governments as well, about AI and data and what they're doing. And actually, one of the reasons why I was particularly drawn to joining the nonprofit and being embedded in my local government is because I have this concern slash fear that the public sector will have a hard time keeping up with how fast AI and machine learning are going. And there's a variety of reasons why it's hard to hire for certain skill sets, just in any like, large entity, especially from a cost perspective. And so that has always been on my mind. It like lives in the back of my mind. It's what I think about every day is this fear that we do things to try to help equity. And I'm just not talking about the local, I just mean in general. We're doing things to help equity. There's a lot of like hot language out there about using AI to help your workflow, and it's not going to replace a person, but it's a tool to be used. But if people are also not using it, if people also don't understand like how they should be using it, how to hold data that's sensitively, and to not put it into somewhere else that you don't own, you can't manage, you can't see, and then other people are just going to train off of it is like one piece. And the other piece is even we'll just use ChatGPT, which is kind of the most common generative, AI out there to do things that are helpful, but it's still missing the equity component because it's going to give you just what it's going to give you. And when we start automating things at scale, are we actually making equity worse? Because you're further doing things at scale that continue to exacerbate the gaps for people who keep becoming edge case scenarios and just keep getting omitted from like those algorithms and automations. And so like the way that I see AI is I was actually asked to be part of like this task force to help suggest a policy for really responsible AI use. And I think the thing that I am hopeful for is that there are enough people realizing what AI could be capable of. And there are enough people who are talking about it to also want to get ahead of how things are. And like we know we need to move quickly. But I think there's a big thing of like as long as we don't, there's this term called like cognitive decision making. So it's like offloading cognitive decision making. As long as we don't offload that are foundationally very human for us, like our critical thinking, that we are accountable. It's almost like I am hopeful about there being some guardrails around like the use of AI, and like have you seen there was that Silicon Valley episode like a while back, and I think it was that where they kind of realized what they had created was so great but actually should it be out there in the world. And so in order to protect humanity, maybe they actually need to like not they need to like kill that product, and so it's like it's also like the use of AI. And so of course it's like the way in which we're innovating as a society, we could do a lot of things, but it's just because you can, like, should you, and I think as long as we have equity represented in those spaces to ask those questions, to even know to ask those questions, I think it'll help other people realize just because we can, like, should we be doing this with AI? And then what does that outcome look like? And I actually had somebody as part of our working session, like our task force, say to me that he was really glad I was there because the things that I was bringing up, he never would have thought of them. Like they just don't live in him, is what he said. And so it helped him think about things from a different perspective. And then this other person chimed in and agreed. And it was that moment where I was like, my responsibility is to make sure equity is represented here. And so that made me feel really good that we had people who are experts in their field. They had spent decades like in tech building that. And for their ability to be exposed to other thoughts, and other when I shared about in practice, like how this looks like or what ends up happening as a result of something that's quasi related, it was so affirming to get people who were like, oh yeah, okay, that's actually good, like, maybe we need to like actually think about this before we kind of come up with like how we should be using this. So I think like more of me in those spaces, like more people who kind of do that and like ask to be part of that discussion, that gives me a lot of hope in like how we'll be using, AI responsibly and for equity. And I also think what's unifying is this fear in general that people have of being completely replaced by AI, which I think makes it different from maybe other topics, because this one is kind of like we're all part of humanity. And I think it's such a tangible, concrete thing that no matter where people fall on the spectrum of their ideas, they can see how they could be replaced, so easily by AI. And so I think there's almost this like rallying around being like, it's moving so quickly. This is great, but okay, like we need to make sure, maybe should it be moving this quickly? Do we need to kind of pause a bit?
I'm so glad that you're willing to ask those questions and that you're being invited to conversations with people, who are making some of these policy decisions. I think, you hit the nail on the head, and the fear is what's guiding a lot of decisions. And it's either there's a group of, fearful artificial intelligence is sort of this nebulous thing that might come for our jobs at some point.
It's just what we call it today. Like it's like AI has always been there in some capacity, but now we have companies that are like rebranding themselves to say like AI assistant, and you're like, it's just automation. It's like you're just automating a script. Like,
And that's what I was going to say, right? Automation has been a concept that's been with us for so long. Physical machines that can do labor, have been replacing jobs or making work easier.
shout out to Smarter Child, that chatbot from AOL.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Thank you. You hit the nail on the head, that we need to preserve our value for human cognitive decision making.
Not brute force things through.
So that we're guiding the process, and equity and ethics in the data that's inputted into training models is being preserved. So I want to pass to Giovanni, who has a question for you.
Hi, Jackie. Your positive attitude is very contagious and it spread out energy. It's obvious, of course. I was wondering, where did you take this such inspiration and such strong energy? Thank you.
I think something's wrong with me. And so it's like my honest answer. But I think so much of it is I just see so much opportunity in every day. Like, where does that come from? I don't know. I don't think there was like one, place that it comes from. But I think a lot of it is like I know myself, and I know myself very sincerely and honestly. And I think a lot of it is like I might not say the things or my ideas or my opinions or when I'm sitting in these tables, in professional environments, or how I even show up in terms of how I dress or how I look. It might not be the standard way or the way that people are trained to do it to be taken seriously, as a profession, especially as a woman of color. I think even if what I say is not popular, if I believe in my intentions, I have the right intentions and I'm coming from a place where I can back this up foundationally. And I think if I know that, then I'm okay if they reject my idea or me. I wouldn't take it as a rejection of me because I'm like, that's fine. Like, I'm not for everybody. Maybe a lot of it is because of like how I had to kind of just, I really early on just always needed to be my own person and represent in a way that I needed, that I it's not like I was consciously like being like I'm representing the way I'm going to represent, but I would just show up and be me. Like, this is me. Like, we just have a lot to do. I'm okay if people don't like me. I think what's more important is that, like, are we moving progress forward for our communities? And so I think just kind of having that, allows me to, I think, not worry about what people think of me. And so I'm able to just be like, that's cool. I'm here. And I have great support with my husband. He knows who he married. So he married a corgi.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you very much for the question, Giovanni. We do like to wrap up with a particular question, which is asking you what words of wisdom or piece of advice you'd want to leave us with today.
Ooh, words of wisdom and piece of advice. I'll share this as like my words of wisdom slash piece of advice. I think for everyone who's a founder, this is the audience of really entrepreneurial people, and it comes back to the whole just because you can, like, should you? Like, sometimes we are trying to help, and are we getting in the way of growth? Are we getting in the way of allowing other people to show up on our behalf and do the things that we need them to do? If there's like that founder syndrome term where a lot of startups, don't make it because the founders can't let go. And you're supposed to hire on people who are better than you or have expertise in a field. And yet, are you really allowing them to do the things that you need them to do for you? If you're constantly telling them, no, actually, like, this is what I want. Like, I need you to just be my yes person. And so I think my advice is there's a piece where, like, I'm very much a player coach and I'm a working manager. My unfounded fear, because I'm aware of this, so I wouldn't let this happen, but my unfounded fear is not wanting to be so far removed from the work that I don't understand what I'm asking people to do. Like, I don't realize how involved it is. I have this unfounded fear of being a bad manager because it's like you could care about people, but are you tasking them with doing things and all you see is like the magic done, but you don't realize like how deep they had to go to scramble and get everything together. So I think there's a balance between that kind of management and trusting your team and allowing your team to do things in the way that they need to do. And so really wanting to understand everyone's different work personas, their communication styles. Maybe this person doesn't like compliments because they're suspicious. So you can't just tell them they did a good job. You have to tell them they did a good job and then specifically be able to say, what it was that you like that they did. But also, like, a part of that is letting them do the things, but before tasking a team with something, having an idea of how you would do it end to end. And there are going to be some trade-offs that need to happen. But like, if you need to jump in and get it launched because there's a blocker, but at least you are helping your team do what you need them to do. And it might be a different approach from what you envisioned, but like maybe that's actually much better. That's why you hired people or you like task people to do something. So I think there's a bit of a blend between understanding what you're asking your teams to actually do and then allowing them to actually do it and going to bat for your team. So like, I know that when I had my technical program managers department, I was like, anybody who needs PTO, I'm confident that I could just cover for everybody if needed to be for like, a short period of time. So if I can do it by myself, I'm excited that now I have people who can help me. So, if somebody wants to take PTO, I don't say no. I don't fight it. I'm just like, okay, like, you do what you need to do. At least I have an understanding of what everyone's working on so I can speak on their behalf and defend their work. So I think as the wisdom is wanting to understand your own management style and like that maybe be the kind of manager that you want to be, and then kind of really take a look at those two pieces and then sincerely ask yourself, like, are you there? Or is there some piece of it that you actually now need to maybe seek some help or coaching or guidance on to help you get to where you want to be as a manager, not just like as a founder who does amazing things, but like, we do no great things alone. And so are you accidentally getting in your own way of success and your own team's way of success by being the person who is kind of like static with how you're being as a manager?
You gave us so much great advice in there. And I think just sort of like summarizing, like you understand who you authentically are and what you bring to the table. And I think that's so powerful. Thank you so much, Jacky. We really appreciate you making so much time for this interview today and being your authentic self, sharing your thoughts and your experience and everything else that you taught us today. And thank you to those who joined us live. We really appreciate you bringing your perspective and just your energy to the discussion. Spencer and I and the team behind Founders Voyage feel really fortunate to be part of this community with you and for the opportunity to bring you cooperative learning experiences like this one each week. Thank you again to everyone. We welcome your nominations for future Saturday session guests. Thank you, Andrew, for introducing us to Jacky. And if you'd like to support Founders Voyage, please listen to our podcast, leave us a review, or donate to our Patreon.
Thank you, Jacky. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
just finished another episode of Founders Voyage, the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. The team at Founders Voyage wants to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed your time with us, and if so, please share this with someone else who might enjoy this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and by donating to our Patreon. Outro music today is Something for Nothing by Reverend Peyton's Big Damn Band.